My sister looked me in the eye on her wedding day and said the words, "I'll never forget you weren't supposed to come, Felicia. I took you off the list." A 36-year-old single woman who just shows houses doesn't fit the image we're projecting. At that moment, I realized I wasn't just unwanted. I was banned, treated as an embarrassment. My name is Felicia Thompson, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the shadow standing just outside the spotlight of my family. At neighborhood parties, my parents would list my sister Victoria's accomplishments like medals pinned to their chest while my own victories lived and died in silence. When she closed a deal at Goldman, it was champagne in the kitchen. When I closed on a property that would change an entire block of Brooklyn Heights, it was barely a nod before the conversation moved on. There is a quiet humiliation in realizing the people who raised you cannot see the worth in what you have built, no matter how hard you fight to show them. I used to tell myself it did not matter, that the long nights and impossible clients and contracts stacked taller than me were enough. But the truth is, it gnawed at me. Every holiday dinner where I was asked if I was still dabbling in real estate. Every phone call where Victoria's voice carried that hint of amusement, as if she were tolerating a child's game. Success to them had only one definition, and it wore my sister's face. For years, I tried to keep smiling, to keep my head down, to believe there was dignity and endurance. But there comes a moment when the weight of being invisible is heavier than the risk of stepping into the light. That moment came faster than I ever imagined, and it began with something as simple as an envelope that changes everything. The envelope arrived on a Thursday afternoon, thick and cream-colored. My name written in a flourish that looked like it had been traced by a machine. Felicia Thompson. I knew before I even opened it. The Plaza Hotel. 350 guests. A $400,000 budget. My mother had whispered like it was a state secret she could not keep to herself. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out the invitation, heavy in my hands as if money had weight. I am 36, a real estate professional in New York, though my family still acts like I am waiting tables somewhere off Broadway. My younger sister Victoria is 32 and senior marketing director at Goldman Sachs, the golden child. She has never been anything else. She is marrying Alex Harrison, the polished CEO of Credit Flow, who just took his company public in one of those deals that makes headlines and cements a reputation. I read about it in the Wall Street Journal while sipping my coffee, knowing that at Sunday dinner in Greenwich my parents would hold the article like scripture. Our parents are Robert and Maggie Irish-American stock, both retired now. My father spent 40 years as an engineer at Boeing, a man of systems and quiet pride, though his pride shines brighter when it comes to Victoria. My mother was an elementary school principal, practical and firm, the type who ran classrooms like kingdoms. They gave us the kind of suburban upbringing people dream of. White clapboard house, a backyard where Victoria always won the races, and I learned to hide my bruised knees behind a book. Victoria was the one they bragged about at block parties. She never missed the honor roll. She got into Wharton. She glided into Goldman Sachs like she had been born for it. She wore blazers before she needed to, heels too tall for a 22-year-old, and she smiled at every adult as if she already knew she was their equal. Meanwhile, I went my own way. Urban planning and MBA, then a career in real estate. 12 years of deals financing closings. Work that requires grit, intuition, and math you do not get wrong. Still, to them, to her, it is nothing more than showing apartments. I held that invitation longer than I should have. The letters pressed into the paper so deep you could feel them with your fingertip. No handwritten note from my sister, no scribbled heart or inside joke. Just the formal elegance of an event that would not be mine. The phone rang that night. I knew it was her before I looked. She did not say hello, just asked if I had gotten the invitation. I told her I had. She waited like she wanted me to gush. When I did not, she asked if I would be bringing anyone. I hesitated. That pause was enough for her to sigh. You know, Felicia, it might be easier if you came alone. It is a very polished guest list. Investors, board members, people flying in from London and Hong Kong. I asked what she meant. She gave a little laugh, too light to be real. I just do not want you to feel out of place. People sometimes do not understand what you do. That property shows things. The words hit harder than she intended, or maybe exactly as she intended. I have negotiated financing packages with private equity firms that could buy and sell her whole wedding twice over. But to her, it was a property showing thing. I forced myself to breathe evenly. I asked how the planning was going. She launched into flowers, the gospel choir, the cake tasting, her voice smoothing over the jab like it had never happened. I murmured in the right places the way an older sister is supposed to. When the call ended, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window. Broadway stretched below me, alive and restless. I told myself I was fine. I told myself I did not need her approval, that my life was mine. But her words kept echoing. Out of place. Property showing thing. The next day I drove up to Greenwich to visit my parents. My mother met me at the door, eyes bright, as if she had been waiting for me just to spill more wedding details. She showed me the seating chart Victoria had sent. Alex's side was a roll call of investors and executives. Our side was family neighbors, a smattering of old friends. She kept pointing out names like trophies. My father joined us in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, though it was barely past noon. He raised it when he mentioned Victoria's latest success at Goldman. Then he turned to me, smiled politely, and asked if I was still busy with that real estate thing. He said it the same way he might ask if I was still knitting scarves for a hobby. I nodded, smiled, told him yes, though I had just closed on a project in Brooklyn Heights that would redefine the neighborhood skyline. There was no point explaining. They did not want to hear it. Later that evening, as I drove back toward the city, the invitation sat on the passenger seat beside me. The paper seemed to glow in the fading light, all gold edges and promises of perfection. I knew I would go. I would wear the dress, I would sit at the table. I would let the photographers catch me smiling while the comparisons hummed beneath every toast. That is what I had always done. But as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, I felt something stir, sharp and alive, a thought I had never let myself entertain for long. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe I was done playing the role they had written for me. The road ahead blurred with the heat rising off the asphalt, and for the first time in years, I let myself imagine what it would feel like to stop being the forgotten sister. I did not know what that would look like yet, but the idea pulsed in my chest, steady and certain as the invitation shifted slightly on the seat beside me. That night I could not sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the city hum outside my window. My phone kept lighting up on the nightstand, a steady stream of messages in the family group chat. Victoria had sent pictures from her latest gown fitting, the silk spilling across her figure like water. My mother replied with hearts, my father with a proud exclamation point. I watched the thread without typing a single word. It felt like being at a dinner table where the conversation never once turns your way yet. You are expected to keep smiling, keep chewing, keep pretending you are full. I thought about the years I had spent building my career in silence, the endless nights combing through contracts, the weekends sacrificed to walkthroughs and client calls, the anxiety of deals that could fall apart in an instant. None of it made it into that group chat. None of it made me the child they toasted with whiskey. I turned the phone face down and pulled the blanket over my head, but even in the dark I could still see her. My sister in her perfect dress at the plaza, every eye on her, every flashbulb catching the glow she carried so effortlessly. And then there was me, somewhere at the edge of the frame, the older sister who smiled because she had forgotten how to do anything else. I still remember the first time I stepped into the offices of Blackstone in 2012. The market was still raw from the crash, but I was 23 and hungry, clutching my new ID badge like it was a ticket to another life. They put me in the multifamily division, a cubicle buried in a sea of analysts tapping on keyboards, parsing spreadsheets, running models until our eyes blurred. It was grunt work, endless and unglamorous, but it was the kind of work that built futures if you were willing to keep your head down and push. Those early years felt like trench warfare. I arrived before sunrise, stayed until the cleaning crew came by, ate takeout at my desk, and memorized more financial models than I care to recall. While my friends were still figuring themselves out, I was learning how to structure deals worth hundreds of millions. No one in my family knew what I did. They only knew I worked long hours in some office downtown. My sister liked to joke that I was probably just staging apartments with throw pillows. By 2015, I had earned my MBA at Columbia, attending classes at night while working full-time. That degree should have been a crown jewel, the thing my parents talked about at dinner parties, but it was only Victoria's Wharton diploma that ever made it onto the mantle. When I graduated, they sent flowers and a card that said, "Congratulations." When Victoria graduated, they threw a catered party with champagne. I rose through the ranks anyway. In 2019, I became vice president, managing teams instead of just models, walking into rooms where decisions were made. In 2023, I was named executive vice president, responsible for a portfolio valued at $2.1 billion. Those numbers were not abstract to me. They were towers of glass and steel across Manhattan, entire neighborhoods, reshaped families moving into places I had helped create. Yet to my parents, to my sister, I was still just showing people around houses. Victoria never once asked about my work, not when I closed on a $100 million development in Long Island City, not when we financed the conversion of an old factory in Brooklyn into lofts that sold out before completion. She never asked because she did not want to know. It was easier to pretend my career was small, because if she admitted it was real, the spotlight might shift even slightly from her. The truth of what I did was far from small. Just last week I sat in my Tribeca office, sunlight spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows onto the conference table, where Marcus Webb from Sequoia Capital leaned forward with that shark smile of his. We were deep in talks on a new Manhattan multi-family complex, a deal that would redefine the skyline on the East River. Marcus tapped a finger on the term sheet. "We like you to lead the partnership, Felicia. Minimum $5 million buy-in for a 2% stake. Conservative estimates put the 5-year return north of $40 million. I kept my expression even though my pulse kicked hard. $40 million on a $5 million entry. I had seen numbers like this before, but every time they still lit something in my chest. The kind of stakes that separated the dabblers from the players. James, my assistant, scribbled notes beside me. When the meeting ended and Marcus clasped my hand, promising to send over the final draft by Monday, James lingered in the doorway. He cleared his throat. "Do not forget Victoria's wedding is next week." The reminder landed like a weight. I gathered the term sheets into a folder, my fingers still buzzing from the numbers I had just seen. My sister's perfect plaza wedding, 350 guests, gospel choirs, designer gowns. And here I was, holding a partnership offer that could turn $5 million into 40, the kind of deal that made legacies. James watched me carefully. "Should I block off the days?" I nodded, sliding the folder shut. "Yes, block them. But make sure Monday morning we have Marcus's draft on my desk." When he left, I leaned back in my chair, the Manhattan skyline glinting beyond the glass. I imagined walking into that ballroom at the plaza my family gathered, the same faces that had looked past me for years. They would talk about Victoria's dress, about Alex's IPO, about the life she had built so flawlessly. And then I would smile and announce what I had just secured, a project worth billions, a partnership that put me on the map not as an older sister still figuring things out, but as someone who had carved her own empire from the ground up. The thought of it curled through me like fire. For once, I would not be the afterthought at their table. For once, I would have the headline worth toasting. I closed my eyes and let the idea settle. A surprise announcement. Not loud, not petty, but undeniable. And for the first time in weeks, the wedding no longer felt like a sentence. It felt like an opportunity. I thought back to when it all began, when the crash of 2008 had gutted the housing market, and everyone swore real estate was poison. My professor said only fools or visionaries would touch it. I did not feel like a visionary then, just stubborn enough to believe the market would recover and someone would have to rebuild it, that someone could be me. I still remember my first deal at Blackstone, a modest renovation of a multi-family building in Queens. The numbers were small compared to the projects I handle now, but the night we closed, I walked home in the rain with my shoes soaked and a grin plastered on my face, because I had been part of putting something back together. My family never heard that story. They never asked. The only milestones that seemed to matter were the ones with brand names attached. Wharton, Goldman Sachs IPO. Victoria's path fit neatly into their vision of success. Mine required explanation charts, patience. They did not want to listen, so I stopped trying. I let their version of me calcify into a role I knew by heart. The older sister who could not quite keep up. The one who dated the wrong men, who lived alone in the city, who had a job nobody understood. At holidays, my parents would beam as Victoria talked about her latest campaign at Goldman. Then they would turn to me politely and ask if the real estate market was still busy, as if I were selling condos one by one on commission. I would answer simply, yes, it's busy, and let the conversation slide back where they wanted it. Sitting in my office now, I realized how much of myself I had kept hidden from them. Not because I was ashamed, but because somewhere along the way I stopped, believing they could see me clearly. The irony was sharp. I managed towers that cast shadows across entire neighborhoods, yet to my own family I was invisible. That invisibility would end at the plaza. I could already picture it. The champagne glasses clinking my father's proud speech. Victoria radiant in her gown. Then my turn, the announcement that would shift the air in the room. They would have to look at me differently, if only for a moment. The thought steadied me. For once, I would not shrink in the background. For once, my voice would be the one they could not ignore. The plaza shimmered with gold that morning, marble floors polished to a mirror, chandeliers blazing above the lobby as though the whole hotel had been set alight. Guests swept in with tuxedos and silk gowns, voices echoing against the high ceilings. I stood outside for a long breath before walking in, smoothing the fabric of my black dress, simple, elegant, deliberate. In my clutch was a slim white envelope. Inside it, a business card that carried more weight than any wedding favor could. The check-in desk was a frenzy. A line of guests snaked across the foyer, each name ticked off by a pair of frantic assistants holding clipboards. When my turn came, I spelled my name slowly, as though the letters might rearrange themselves if I hurried. The young woman with the headset frowned, scanning the list once, then twice. "I'm sorry, Miss Thompson, you're not on here." "That can't be right," I said. I held out the embossed invitation, heavy as proof, in my hand. She checked again, her brow knitting. "Perhaps you're listed under a different party." I could feel the line pressing. Behind me, the impatient shuffling of heels and the scent of cologne filling the air. She stepped aside to confer with another planner, both of them whispering with a nervous glance in my direction. Finally, one of them murmured, "This guest isn't listed. What do we do?" Before the answer came, a ripple moved through the crowd. The bride herself appeared a vision in white satin, her veil pinned perfectly, her lipstick flawless. Victoria, of course, would arrive at her own wedding looking like she had stepped from the cover of a magazine. She spotted me, her eyes narrowing for just a flicker before she pasted on her practiced smile. "Felicia, what seems to be the problem?" The planner rushed to explain. "Miss Thompson's name doesn't appear on the list." Victoria's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed smooth. "Thank you, I'll handle this." She gestured me aside toward a marble alcove, away from the stream of guests filing into the ballroom. The mask slipped the moment we were alone. Her eyes were sharp, her voice low and cutting. "You weren't supposed to come, Felicia?" I blinked. "Excuse me." She crossed her arms over the glittering bodice of her gown. "I took you off the list. I can't have my failed sister mingling with Alex's investors, talking about your little real estate thing. Marcus Webb from Sequoia is here, 3 Goldman board members. Alex's entire executive team. This is not the place for you." Her words landed like stones. My mouth went dry. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. She kept going, merciless in her perfection. A 36-year-old single woman who shows houses doesn't fit the image. We're projecting. "Do you understand this day isn't about you? It's about the life Alex and I have built." I swallowed hard, holding her gaze, though every muscle wanted to collapse. For a moment, I wanted to shout, to throw every title, every number, every deal in her face. I wanted to strip away the smug certainty that dripped from her every syllable. But instead, something steadier rose inside me. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the white envelope. I placed it in her hand, though she looked at it like it was nothing more than a bill she didn't want to pay. "Make sure Victoria gets this during the reception," I said quietly to the wedding coordinator who hovered nearby, confusion clouding her face. "The timing matters." Then I straightened my shoulders, met my sister's eyes one last time, and turned back toward the revolving doors. The marble floor no longer gleamed. The chandeliers no longer glittered. The whole place felt hollow, a stage where I had been written out before the first act. I stepped outside into the noise of Fifth Avenue, the city air rushing at me like a wave, and I walked away without looking back. The September air clung warm against my skin as I stepped out of the plaza. I should have called a cab, but my feet carried me down Fifth Avenue as if the rhythm of the city could drown the ache pressing against my ribs. Women in jewel-toned dresses hurried past men, adjusted tuxedo jackets. A brass band's echo drifted faintly from Central Park. It all felt like a cruel backdrop to the truth that had just unfolded in marble and chandeliers. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who trailed Victoria through shopping malls and listened to her recite SAT scores like hymns. Even then, I knew her approval was conditional, but some stubborn part of me had clung to the idea that blood might soften judgment. Now, watching a line of black cars pull up to the hotel awning, I saw it clearly. I wasn't family at all, at least not the kind that got counted on guest lists. I slipped into a quiet side street, leaning against the cold stone of a storefront. The envelope was gone now, surrendered to the wedding planner's hands. Inside it was nothing dramatic, no speech or letter, just a card. My name embossed, my title sharp, the portfolio number glinting like armor, a reminder that the story Victoria told about me wasn't the truth. She had reduced years of work into a punchline, but the math didn't lie. $2.1 billion under management. I held that in my chest like a secret victory. A text buzzed in my phone, jolting me. "James again. Is everything good? Need me to swing by?" I stared at the words until they blurred. I typed back, "All fine, enjoy your night off." Then I powered the phone down. "Some humiliations you don't broadcast, not even to the people who have earned your trust." I kept walking, the click of my heels loud against the pavement. At a corner cafe, couples crowded around tiny tables, champagne flutes catching the light. Inside, someone toasted loudly to begin. I stood there a moment, watching the bubbles rise, and thought of Victoria's voice hissing in that alcove. Failed sister. 36 and single, an embarrassment. My reflection caught in the window glass, the black dress sleek, the lines of my face sharper than I remembered. There was no failure looking back at me, only someone who had carved her own place in the world. Maybe not the kind of place my family would ever respect, but one that mattered all the same. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, the city buzzing outside. My hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline finally breaking through the shell of composure I had forced. For years I had measured myself against my father's ledger, Victoria's milestones, the chorus of their friends who asked polite questions they didn't care to hear the answers to. Tonight had stripped the illusion bare. I would never win their game because I was never meant to be a player. Somewhere inside that ballroom, a string quartet would be striking up, the waiters circulating with trays of champagne. The envelope would sit untouched on a coordinator's desk until the moment I had requested. I pictured Victoria's manicured nails tearing it open, her laugh freezing, her face faltering when she realized what it was. Not revenge exactly, more like truth. Time to land in a room full of people who had never seen me at all. I sipped the bitter coffee, the taste grounding me. I had wanted this day to be different, to bridge something broken between us. But maybe this fracture wasn't meant to heal. Maybe it was meant to split wide enough for me to finally step out, no longer trying to earn a place at their table. The clock over the cafe bar read nearly 7. Soon the reception would be underway, and the envelope would move from hand to hand until it found her. I imagined the music pausing, the speeches quieting, the murmur rippling as eyes turned, not on me, not anymore, but on the reality she had tried so hard to erase. For the first time all day, I felt something loosen in my chest. It wasn't a triumph, not yet. It was space, the kind that makes room for air after years of being compressed into someone else's definition. I folded my hands in my lap, let the hum of conversation fill the silence around me, and waited for the city to turn the page. The envelope had felt heavier than paper when I slid it into the wedding planner's hand. I knew Victoria would think it was a check, some desperate attempt to buy her approval with a gesture she could brush aside. But it was never that. Inside was an opportunity, the kind of opportunity people fought tooth and nail to even be allowed to see. The Manhattan multifamily complex has been my life for the past 3 years. 15 luxury residential towers spread from Tribeca to the Upper East Side, 2,000 units in total, each one placed with the precision of a chess move. We had scouted every parcel, negotiated every air right, fought zoning boards until midnight, secured financing that would have made most firms choke. The portfolio was worth billions, the kind of project whispered about at private clubs, the kind that cemented legacies. My division at Blackstone oversaw every brick, every lease, every number. Victoria had once confessed to me over cocktails years ago that she wanted a pied-à-terre overlooking Central Park. She had said it like a daydream, but I had heard the hunger in her voice. She liked the gleam of ownership, the illusion of permanence, so I had tailored the documents with her in mind. Not a glossy brochure, not a sales pitch, but the actual partnership structure. $5 million minimum buy-in, 2% equity, 5 years projected. A return of $40 million and 800% yield. It was audacious, but it was real, and it bore the Blackstone letterhead. My plan had been simple. During the reception in front of Alex's investors, Goldman board members, and half of New York's financial elite, I would hand her the folder. She would see me not as the embarrassing older sister in a black dress, but as the woman holding a piece of Manhattan's future in her hands. For once, the narrative would be undeniable. But instead, I sat alone at a small French restaurant 2 blocks from the hotel, the soft clatter of cutlery around me, a glass of wine sweating in my hand. I had ordered steak frites, barely touched it, the butter cooling into a film on the plate. My phone lay face down beside me, buzzing every few seconds until the table vibrated. When I finally flipped it over, the screen lit up with her name. 47 missed calls, voicemails stacked one after another. Victoria's voice spilled through the speaker when I pressed play, the same voice that had sliced me open hours before, now trembling with something closer to fear than disdain. Felicia, is this real? The Blackstone letterhead, the project details. This can't be real. Please tell me you didn't give this to anyone else. Please call me back. Another message followed. I can't talk about this with Alex's people without knowing if it's legitimate. They're asking me questions. Everyone saw the envelope. Just pick up, for God's sake. I sipped my wine and let the words wash over me. For years, I had imagined what it would take to pierce her certainty, to make her voice crack, to shake the unshakable golden child. And here it was, not born of revenge, but of truth too big to be ignored. The waiter paused by my table, eyeing my untouched plate. Everything all right, Miss Fine, I said, though the word tasted like ash. Outside, through the window, I could still see the shimmer of the plaza's lights. Car after car lined along Fifth Avenue. Inside that ballroom, the band would be swelling the toasts beginning. And in the middle of it all, my sister, clutching the proof of everything she had spent her life denying about me. The phone buzzed again. I didn't answer. I let it ring steady as a heartbeat while I cut into the steak, finally bringing a bite to my lips. It was cold chewy, but it didn't matter. For the first time that day, I wasn't swallowing humiliation. I was tasting something different. Power, maybe. Or freedom. The next voicemail came through while I chewed. "Felicia, it's me again. I'm begging you don't let anyone else see this before we talk. I'll make it worth your while. Just pick up." I set my fork down and stared at the city outside. The truth was, she had already let everyone see. That had been the point. And now nothing would ever be the same. The voicemails blurred together after a while, her voice rising and falling between panic and pleading. At one point she was furious, accusing me of trying to humiliate her on the biggest day of her life. 2 messages later, she was soft, almost childlike, reminding me of when we were girls and she begged me to cover for her sneaking out to meet a boyfriend. It was strange hearing her shift so wildly, as if trying every key on the piano until one might play the note that moved me. I leaned back in my chair, the restaurant thinning out around me, waiters clearing tables for the late-night crowd. I could see my reflection in the darkened window, faint against the lights of the city. My hair pinned neatly, my dress still perfect despite the hours. For once, I didn't look like the forgotten sister in someone else's story. I looked like a woman who had made a choice. The truth was, I hadn't set out to ruin her wedding. I had imagined a different kind of scene, one where she beamed at me with gratitude, introducing me proudly to her circle, acknowledging what I had built. But I knew now that day would never come. Victoria's admiration was a currency she spent only on people she believed could lift her higher. And she had decided long ago I wasn't worth the investment. So I gave her something she couldn't ignore. Something so real, so heavy with potential, it would force her to see me whether she wanted to or not. I thought of Marcus Webb, likely still inside that ballroom, the kind of man who could spot an opening in a crowded market the way a hawk spots a rabbit in a field. If he had seen the documents, he would already be calculating the angles, asking why Victoria had them, wondering what part she played. I almost smiled at the thought. She had spent her whole life curating an image, and with one envelope, I had shifted the spotlight. The phone buzzed again, then stopped. For the first time that night, there was silence. I exhaled long and slow and finally signaled for the check. As I signed the receipt, I imagined Victoria in the gilded ballroom, her perfect wedding teetering on a fault line she never saw coming. When I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the September air was cool against my skin. Taxis darted past, couples laughed arm in arm, the city oblivious to the storm brewing inside one of its most famous hotels. I slipped my phone into my clutch and started walking, not toward the plaza, not toward home, but simply forward, my heels striking a rhythm against the pavement. Behind me, somewhere in that golden tower, my sister was realizing that the narrative of her life was no longer entirely hers to write. For once, I wasn't on the outside looking in. I had moved the pieces, and the game had only just begun. It started long before the wedding, long before the envelope or the voicemails or the look on Victoria's face when she realized she couldn't control the narrative anymore. It started the night Alex leaned across my parents' dining table in Greenwich, carving into his steak with surgical precision, and asked me what I thought about vacancy rates in Midtown. He had framed it as casual, the kind of cocktail chatter investment types love to drop into conversations. I remember answering automatically, citing a quarterly trend I had been working on at Blackstone. Something harmless enough, I thought. But later after dessert, I replayed his phrasing in my head and realized how targeted it had been. That was the first breadcrumb. Over the next few months, the questions became more pointed. How quickly do you think luxury units in Tribeca are absorbed? What's Blackstone's read on financing appetite in Brooklyn waterfront? He never asked. In front of strangers, always in the safe cocoon of family dinners, my parents beaming at the way he showed interest in my work. They thought it was respect. I knew it was mining. The day Credit Flow's IPO launched, I felt the sick churn in my stomach as I scanned the financial pages. The numbers were almost too perfect. Growth projections aligned suspiciously well with shifts in real estate, liquidity shifts I had discussed in private and confidence. In context never meant to leave my office, he had used me as his own personal oracle, pulling threads from conversations and weaving them into the illusion of inevitability that drove his valuation through the roof. I didn't confront him then. I did what I always do. I documented. I backed up my emails. I flagged the odd timing of his trades against regulatory filings. And when my gut screamed louder, I did something I never thought I would. I recorded him, quietly, discreetly, while he refilled his glass of wine in my parents' kitchen and asked me if I thought vacancy rates in Queens would stay flat through winter. I answered casually, but the microphone in my phone caught every syllable. By the time summer rolled around, I had a trail. Email chains where he fished for details under the guise of family curiosity. A dinner conversation where he practically recited Blackstone's confidential slide deck back to me. It wasn't enough to destroy him, not yet, but it was enough to begin. I reached out to a legal team recommended by a colleague, and together we started threading the pieces into a case. Still, I waited. Part of me wanted to believe I was wrong, that Alex was just another ambitious man with a too-sharp smile, not a criminal building a fortune on stolen whispers. Then came the wedding. The deliberate strike from Victoria, the erasure of my name, the casual cruelty in her voice as she told me a single woman who shows houses wasn't part of her image. That was the last straw. The morning after, my phone lit up with names that made my chest tighten. Marcus Webb, a partner from Sequoia I had met only days earlier. 2 others, numbers I recognized as belonging to hedge funds that had backed credit flow. They weren't calling about me. They were calling because of Alex. Word was spreading. They had seen the envelope, the Blackstone header, the project details. They wanted to know what the connection was. They were putting the pieces together faster than I expected. And then from an unexpected angle came Bella, 28 years old, the quieter Harrison sibling, an associate at Goldman who had learned quickly that invisibility was sometimes survival. She reached out to me through a message on LinkedIn of all places, short and clipped, asking if we could meet off record. When we finally sat down in a noisy cafe near Battery Park, she pulled out her phone, hands shaking. Recordings. She had been making them for months, documenting her brother's boasts during family gatherings, his slip-ups about leveraging private information to stay ahead of markets. She hadn't understood the full scope until she overheard him gloating about me, about how useful it was to have a sister-in-law at Blackstone. That was the word he used, useful. Bella looked at me like she was betraying blood. I told her she was saving herself. Whistleblower was an ugly word, but it was the truth. Within a week, the SEC had opened a preliminary investigation. Not the hammer falling, not yet, but the first crack of thunder before a storm. Credit Flow's stock began to stutter small dips at first, then sharper ones as whispers hardened into suspicions. The IPO glow was fading. The market could smell weakness, and weakness in finance spreads like rot. Victoria's honeymoon was cut short. By the time she and Alex returned from St. End, Bart's subpoenas were being drafted. I heard from my mother that Victoria hadn't been eating, that she spent her mornings pacing the terrace of their Park Avenue apartment, chain-smoking like a college student before finals. She had married into a legacy she thought was untouchable, only to discover it was made of glass. I told no one what I held in my files. The recordings, the emails, the threads woven tight enough to strangle his empire. I didn't need to. The wheel was already turning faster than anyone could stop it. All I had to do was wait and watch as the perfect marriage, the perfect IPO, the perfect image my sister had curated began to crack under pressure too, heavy to bear. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the forgotten one at the edge of the frame. I felt like the one holding the camera. The calls from my parents started next, my mother's voice hushed and frantic, asking if I had heard the news about Credit Flow's sudden decline. My father more direct, wanting to know if I had said something to anyone at Blackstone that might have leaked. I listened to them both without answering, letting their worry fill the silence. For once, they weren't talking about Victoria's triumphs. They were talking about Alex's mistakes, about the cracks spreading through the Harrison name, about the possibility of disgrace. In the quiet after those calls, I sat by my window overlooking the Hudson and felt something close to calm. The city glowed beneath me, restless and alive, but I felt still, like I had been bracing against a storm for years and was finally standing in its eye. I thought about Victoria, about how she must have been rehearsing explanations to her friends, investors, colleagues. The humiliation she had tried so carefully to keep away from me was now pressing down on her with the weight of headlines and market screens. I almost pitied her. Almost. But pity didn't erase the words she had spoken at the plaza, the deliberate way she had cut me out, the way she had twisted the knife with a smile. No, pity wasn't the right response. Recognition was. She was finally recognizing what I had always known, that power isn't something you inherit or marry into. It's something you hold steady when others lose their grip. The next morning, Bella called again. Her voice was steadier now, colder. She said the SEC had moved from whispers to paperwork, and Alex's name was on more than one draft. I thanked her quietly, hung up, and opened my laptop. It was time to see just how fast a perfect empire could fall. I was still reeling from the fallout of Credit Flow when Emma called and asked to meet. She insisted on a quiet spot away from Wall Street and chose a coffee shop in Brooklyn where nobody would recognize us. She arrived with a folder clutched to her chest, her eyes darting around like she was carrying contraband. When she slid the folder across the table to me, I hesitated before opening it. Inside were printouts of my old slides, the ones I had built years ago when I was still finding my place in real estate. They were titled Generational Wealth Through Real Estate Structures. I had labored over every chart, every example, pulling late nights at Blackstone's office until my eyes burned. Next to them were time-stamped emails from my old account, the drafts I had sent Emma back when I was asking her to look them over before my first big pitch. The shock hit like cold water. Emma's voice was steady as she explained. 5 years ago, Victoria had gotten hold of those materials. She had taken them, rebranded them with Goldman's logo, and presented them as her own. The presentation had been a sensation. It was the spark that pushed her out of the pack and onto the fast track. Within a year, she was promoted to senior director, her reputation as a strategist cemented. I stared at the pages, bile rising in my throat. All those years of being measured against her, of hearing my parents marvel at her brilliance, when the truth was sitting right in front of me. She had stolen the very work that had kept me up at night, the ideas that had been mine. Emma placed a hand on mine. She said she had kept quiet because she was scared, because she thought nobody would believe her over Victoria. But after the wedding, after Alex's unraveling, she decided she could not carry the secret any longer. She said the family deserved to know. I looked at her and realized she meant I deserved to know. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. My parents called a family meeting in Westchester, claiming it was time to address the chaos that had spilled from the wedding into every headline. The Harrisons were invited too, as if their presence could help salvage some dignity. I knew this would be my moment. When I walked into the living room, Victoria was already there, sitting perfectly composed in her navy sheath dress, her diamond ring catching the light. She gave me a smile that didn't touch her eyes. My father cleared his throat, announcing that we needed to address the rumors and restore unity. I almost laughed. Unity had never been real in this family. I placed Emma's folder on the coffee table and slid it toward Victoria. Her smile faltered. She flipped through the pages, then snapped the folder shut. She said she didn't know what this was supposed to prove. I told her it proved everything. That her career had been built on my work. That every headline she had basked in, every promotion she had celebrated, had been stolen from me. She shook her head, denying it with a laugh too sharp to sound natural. Then her tone shifted. She said I never would have used it anyway. That I had been wasting my talent on scraps of projects, too afraid to claim the spotlight. She said she did what I could not do, and that made it hers. Something in me snapped. I told her she had been sabotaging me for years, whispering to our parents that I was unstable, that my relationships ended because I was too difficult, too focused on work. She didn't deny it. Instead, she lifted her chin and said somebody had to control the narrative, otherwise I would have dragged the family name down with mediocrity. The room went still. My mother's hands trembled. My father's face was drained of color. For the first time, I saw them questioning her instead of me. Chris Blake, who had been silent until then, leaned forward. He said he had worked with me, directly seen my deals, seen the scale of what I had built without ever needing to steal from anyone. He said the family owed me an apology for years of dismissal and condescension. His words cut through the tension like a blade. Victoria flushed, her composure cracking. She demanded to know why everyone was suddenly against her, why nobody appreciated what she had sacrificed to bring honor to the family. That was when Patricia Harrison spoke up. She had been quiet on the sofa, but now she fixed Victoria with a stare that brooked no argument. Patricia said the way she had treated me was disgraceful, that women in this world had to fight hard enough without tearing each other down, and that stealing another woman's work was a betrayal far worse than gossip. Victoria tried to speak again, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time in my life, I watched her shrink instead of swell. My parents called for a break, retreating to the kitchen like generals regrouping after a lost battle. The others murmured in clusters, but I stayed seated, my eyes on the closed folder that had detonated years of lies. Emma came to sit beside me, her hand light on my shoulder. She whispered that it was only the beginning, that once the truth spread beyond these walls, Victoria's entire reputation would unravel just as quickly as Alex's empire had. I believed her. When my parents returned, their faces were grave. My father spoke first, his voice rougher than I had ever heard it. He said the family had made mistakes, that lines had been crossed. He didn't say Victoria's name, but the silence around it was louder than anything else. Victoria sat stiffly, her jaw clenched, her hands locked in her lap. For once, there were no words to rescue her. I didn't feel triumph, not yet. What I felt was the weight of truth finally pressing down on the right shoulders. After years of being the shadow sister, the unsuccessful one, I was no longer invisible. The meeting ended without resolution. My parents calling it a pause, as if the family could be patched with polite conversation. But I knew better. Some fractures only deepen with time. When I left the house, the evening air was sharp and cool. I walked to my car slowly, my body trembling with the aftermath of confrontation. Chris caught up to me in the driveway. He said quietly that he was proud of me, that I had shown more strength than anyone else in that room. I nodded, unable to speak. As I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, I let the silence wrap around me. For the first time in years, it did not feel like loneliness. It felt like freedom. I sat in my apartment with the stack of documents on the table, the ones Felicia Thompson Foundation's lawyers had drafted with precision. My name was stamped across the top, every line tying me to something larger than a business deal, larger than revenge. For weeks I had carried the burden of deciding what to do with the partnership, opportunity, the one that could turn $5 million into 40, the one Victoria had once dreamed would cement her place among the elite. The answer came to me not in a burst of inspiration, but in the quiet aftermath of chaos. I realized I could no longer measure myself by my sister's hunger for status. Instead of handing her the golden key she had demanded in front of our entire family, I was giving it to women who had been told no too many times. That is how the Felicia Thompson Foundation for Women Entrepreneurs was born. I met Dr. Maria Santos in a small conference room overlooking Bryant Park. She was a professor at NYU, a woman who had built her own nonprofit from nothing and had scars from battles with investors who had once dismissed her as too emotional, too impractical. Her presence was calm but commanding. When I explained that I wanted the foundation to be led by someone who had lived through rejection and still built something lasting, her eyes softened. She said she understood exactly what I was trying to do. Together, we outlined the first initiative, a $20 million fund dedicated to female-led startups, especially those abandoned by families or overlooked by traditional investors. I remembered all the times I had been labeled the unstable one, the disappointing one, and I thought of women who carried the same labels in different homes, in different cities. The fund was for them. The paperwork took weeks. Transfers, legal approvals, tax considerations. During those weeks, the headlines continued to swirl around credit flow and around my sister. Alex's name was printed daily with words like fraud and investigation attached. The SEC widened its probe, connecting his deals to data he should never have had. Investors whispered about who else might be implicated. His smile on magazine covers now looked like a mask. Victoria stayed silent in public, but silence in Manhattan finance was never neutral. Her colleagues at Goldman began to whisper. Questions rose about how much she had known, about the timing of her recommendations, about the mysterious overlaps between her projects and Alex's. Then came the announcement that she was suspended, pending an internal investigation. It wasn't termination, not yet, but suspension was enough to stain a reputation permanently. When the foundation documents were filed, she learned about it through the legal notices her lawyers had copied her on. That was the moment she understood what she had lost. Not just money, but the chance to control a legacy, the chance to attach her name to something that would outlast her titles. She called me late at night, her voice ragged with disbelief. She asked me if I had really transferred the entire partnership to a foundation instead of offering it to her. I didn't lie. I told her yes. I told her I was done fueling her vanity. She hung up without another word. The foundation's launch was covered by business media across several weeks. Articles spoke of a bold new model, of redirecting wealth into female innovation, of challenging the old networks that decided who deserved a chance. They wrote about me as if I had always been this confident, this visionary. The irony was that it had taken years of humiliation for me to get here. I cut out one article and pinned it above my desk. Not for pride, but as a reminder that every no I had ever heard had carried me to this yes. Meanwhile, Victoria's world was shrinking. Colleagues avoided her in the lobby. Calls went unanswered. At family dinners, the conversations turned toward her suspension with a mix of pity and quiet judgment. She tried to act composed, but the edge in her voice betrayed her. She hated being questioned, hated the way her control was slipping. Alex made everything worse. He raged at her in private, though the walls in their penthouse were not thick enough to keep his voice from spilling into the hallway. He blamed her family for the scrutiny and said the disaster at the wedding had drawn attention they could have avoided. He told her she had ruined him. She called me once after one of those fights, her voice thin as if she had been crying. She didn't ask for comfort. She just said that sometimes she wished she had never opened that envelope. I didn't know how to answer. the foundation grew faster than I expected. Applications flooded in from women across the country, each with stories that echoed mine. A mother of two who had been told she was too distracted to run a company. A young founder whose family refused to co-sign a loan because they thought her idea was foolish. A brilliant engineer who had been dismissed at 3 firms because her demeanor was not polished enough. Each application reminded me why I had chosen this path. At the first board meeting, Maria leaned across the table and told me I was building more than a fund. She said I was building a lifeline. For the first time in my career, I felt like I was creating something that could not be stolen, because it wasn't built to serve a single name. It was built to multiply. Still, there were nights I sat awake thinking about Victoria. I wondered if she understood the full magnitude yet. The loss wasn't just measured in dollars. It was measured in the way her legacy would be remembered. She had always wanted to be the sister who rose higher, who proved she was the star. But the spotlight was shifting, and this time she couldn't control it. I thought about calling her, about offering some truce, but the memory of her words stopped me. "You were wasting your talent. You never would have used it anyway." Those words had been her justification for theft. They echoed every time I picked up the phone until I set it down again. One evening, as the sun sank over the Hudson, I stood at my apartment window watching the city lights flicker on. Somewhere downtown, Alex was likely preparing for another deposition. Somewhere uptown, Victoria was staring at her silent phone, waiting for someone from Goldman to tell her the nightmare was over. Neither call was coming, and for the first time I didn't feel sorry. A week after the foundation announcement, I walked into a coffee shop near Union Square and noticed 2 women at the corner table whispering over the business section of the Times. My picture was printed above the headline about the fund. I caught fragments of their words. How refreshing it was to see money redirected toward women instead of another vanity project. I slipped past without introducing myself, but my chest felt strangely light. For years, I had been invisible even in rooms I had worked to build. Now strangers were dissecting my name as if it mattered. At the same time, Victoria was unraveling. Emma told me she had spotted her cousin in Goldman's cafeteria, sitting alone with untouched food while junior associates avoided her table. The silence around her was its own form of punishment. I should have felt vindicated, but there was an ache under the relief. She had wanted to be admired, and instead she was shrinking before the very audience she once ruled. That night, Maria called to say the foundation's first grant had been approved. A small company in Brooklyn, led by 2 sisters, would receive seed funding. I couldn't help but think about how differently my own sister and I had chosen to use power. The first TikTok appeared 3 days after the wedding. A guest had recorded the moment I was stopped at the entrance of the plaza, clutching my small black clutch while the wedding planner flipped through her clipboard. My name was missing. The video caught Victoria sweeping through the lobby in her gown, pausing just long enough to look me over with that practiced impatience before disappearing into the ballroom. No words were needed. The caption read, "Imagine being turned away from your own sister's wedding." At first, it barely registered. A handful of comments, a few thousand views. But within a week, other clips surfaced. Someone filmed me leaving the hotel, my posture stiff, my face unreadable. Another caught Victoria snapping at the coordinator. Each fragment alone meant little, but together they built a narrative no amount of Instagram filters could erase. The hashtag WeddingGate took off slowly, then snowballed. 2 million views across dozens of posts, each stitched with strangers confessing their own family betrayals. People saw in me their own sisters who excluded them, their own parents who played favorites. My inbox filled with messages from women I had never met, thanking me for simply standing there with my head held high. I had not set out to make a statement, but somehow I had become one. Meanwhile, Victoria's carefully curated world unraveled. Her Instagram once glowed with staged brunches and sunset yacht rides. Now every post was flooded with comments. "Why did you treat your sister like that, family before image?" Some were cruel, but most were disappointed. A far more cutting tone for someone who had built a career on likability. The wedding live stream that she and Alex had arranged through a luxury platform backfired spectacularly. What was meant to showcase the union of finance royalty became a cautionary tale replayed across gossip sites and business blogs alike. Clips of Victoria laughing with board members while her sister was excluded. Outside were spliced with headlines about elitism, arrogance, and hypocrisy. Goldman could not ignore it. The internal review that had begun quietly after murmurs of the plagiarized presentation picked up speed as the online firestorm spread. Within weeks, investigators traced the slides back to my original work. Time-stamped drafts and Emma's archived emails left no room for doubt. Victoria was given a leave of absence, not termination, but the signal was clear. Her spotless record had been stained. Alex fared no better. Credit Flow's stock had been sliding since whispers of the SEC probe first surfaced, but now the couple's tarnished image only fueled skepticism. Analysts questioned whether the company's meteoric rise had been smoke and mirrors. The board issued a statement of support, but it rang hollow against daily headlines about expanding investigations. His title as CEO remained intact for now, but even he looked diminished on CNBC interviews, his charm dulled, his confidence cracked. The power couple facade had dissolved in the most public way possible. At dinners in Manhattan, they were whispered about not as aspirational figures but as warnings. Success built on stolen ideas and insider whispers was no longer enviable. It was radioactive. Through it all, I kept my focus on the foundation. The media began calling. First, the small podcasts that catered to women entrepreneurs, then larger outlets like Business Weekly and Forbes. They wanted to know how I had endured years of being minimized by my own family while still building a career. They wanted to know why I had chosen to channel a fortune into helping others, rather than seeking revenge. I answered carefully, never embellishing, never exaggerating. I spoke about boundaries, about the quiet strength of working without recognition, about how women are often told to be grateful for scraps when they are capable of building empires. It was surreal seeing my words quoted on LinkedIn posts and business forums. Some framed me as a symbol, others as a survivor. What I felt most, though, was tiredness. Tired of years of being the invisible one, tired of carrying wounds my family never acknowledged. But with each interview, I sensed something shifting. For once, I was not standing in Victoria's shadow. I was not being compared, dismissed, or diminished. I was simply myself, and that seemed to be enough. The irony was not lost on me. Victoria had spent her life constructing an image of perfection, and it had collapsed under the weight of a single night. I had spent mine being underestimated, and somehow that invisibility had become my strength. People trusted me because I had nothing to prove. Late one night, after another interview request lit up my inbox, I scrolled through the comments under the hashtag. Strangers had written that watching me refuse to crumble gave them courage to face their own families. A young woman wrote that she finally told her mother she would not be attending Christmas with a brother who mocked her career. Another said she had applied for a loan for her bakery after years of being told she was too fragile for business. I closed the phone and sat in silence. The wedding that was supposed to cement my sister's legacy had, without her intention, given me my voice. And for the first time in years, I felt no urge to compete with her, no urge to prove myself. The world had already decided whose story mattered now. One afternoon in late February, I stopped by a cafe in Midtown after a meeting, and the barista looked at me with recognition that made me pause. She handed over my coffee and whispered that she had watched the videos, that her own sister had excluded her from a wedding too. For a moment, we were just two women with different lives, but the same scar. I walked out into the cold air with the cup warming my hands and realized how far the story had traveled beyond New York society pages. It had become something people in small towns and suburbs whispered about in their kitchens. Victoria tried to fight back. She hired a publicist to frame the incident as a misunderstanding, suggesting the guest list had been mismanaged. But the internet is merciless. Screenshots of her texts to vendors leaked, showing her insistence that I not be allowed entry without explicit approval. The denial only fueled the fire. The more she protested, the more people dissected her words for arrogance. Alex kept silent longer, but silence from a man whose career was built on convincing investors seemed like an admission. Credit Flow employees began posting anonymously on forums, hinting at a toxic culture and questionable accounting. Each week, a new thread appeared, dissected by financial blogs until stock prices dipped further. By March, the couple's faces had become shorthand for excess and downfall, not glamour and aspiration. At night, I scrolled through the articles, not with glee, but with a strange detachment. There was no satisfaction in watching them fall apart, only a reminder that lies eventually rot from the inside. I thought back to the wedding night, standing in that lobby as laughter floated through the ballroom doors. The sting of rejection was still sharp, but it had transformed into something I carried differently now, less like a wound and more like a boundary line carved into stone. When another podcast invited me to speak about resilience, I hesitated, then agreed. Sitting in the studio with headphones pressed against my ears, I told the host that success is not about winning a competition your family invents, but about creating space where your own voice matters. For once, I believed the words as I spoke them. The first time I walked into the SEC offices in Lower Manhattan, I could feel the weight of history in the air, the kind of place where decisions altered lives forever. My palms were damp, but I reminded myself that I was not on trial. I was a protected witness. Still, the formality of it all pressed against my chest like a stone. They asked me to recount what I knew about Alex's dealings and Victoria's role in passing information along. I told them about the dinners when Alex spoke too freely about development, deals, about Victoria's habit of slipping family documents into her bag after visits, about the unease I had felt but had buried for years. Every word felt like dragging a stone from the riverbed and laying it on the table. Weeks later, investigators uncovered emails where Alex had coordinated land purchases using data not yet public. Bella Harrison's recordings of private conversations filled in the blanks, her voice steady and clear as Alex laid out how he timed acquisitions before announcements. The casualness of his tone chilled me. It was not a mistake or a single lapse, but a system he had built and refined. Victoria's name appeared in threads too, forwarding confidential attachments late at night, her notes scrawled in margins. Federal prosecutors had not yet decided on charges, but the walls were closing in. Each headline stretched the process longer, speculation filling the gaps the law had yet to close. Goldman, unwilling to risk its reputation, placed Victoria on indefinite suspension. The announcement was clinical, a single line in a press release, but I could imagine the humiliation burning under her skin. At home, my parents wrestled with a dawning awareness. My mother clutched her pearls as if squeezing them could reverse the truth. My father paced the den, muttering about lawyers and appearances, but I saw something else in his eyes. The first flicker of recognition that his constant indulgence of Victoria had not been love but permission. For decades, they had chosen not to see, and now the damage stretched beyond repair. The family itself fractured. Emma came by one evening with a stack of tea bags and an old quilt. No explanations needed. Patricia called after her lectures, her voice brisk but warm, urging me to stay grounded. They reminded me that I was not alone in this, though some cousins still sent cold texts accusing me of destroying family harmony. It was easier for them to blame the sister who told the truth than to face the sister who built her empire on lies. Through all of it, Chris stood with me. Reporters loitered outside his office, digging into every corner of his career to see if he had skeletons too. He told me over dinner one night that he had been offered a chance to distance himself, a polite statement about respecting both sides. He refused. His eyes were steady as he said it, and in that moment I realized that loyalty is clearest when the ground shakes, hardest. Victoria tried to salvage what was left of her image. She released a statement that read more like a legal brief than an apology, speaking of misunderstandings and her devotion to integrity. Social media tore it apart within hours. Screenshots of her past comments, cruel jokes she had made at my expense, lined up against her newfound contrition. Instead of softening her image, it hardened the perception that she was simply maneuvering, clinging to whatever narrative could keep her afloat. I avoided most of this media storm, but sometimes late at night I searched her name and read through the comments. People who had once envied her spoke with scorn now, and I felt no triumph in it. The downfall of a sister is not something you cheer for, even when she has wounded you. It felt more like watching a slow collapse of a building you once lived in, a structure that had sheltered and suffocated you at the same time. During one of our strained family dinners, my mother finally asked me, her voice small, how much I had known. I told her the truth, that I had suspected but had not had proof until recently. She nodded, tears glinting in her eyes, and for the first time she admitted that she had seen things too, but chosen to believe Victoria's explanations. My father said nothing, his jaw set, but I noticed he did not defend her either. Silence can be its own confession. As spring edged closer, the investigation dragged on, each week a new round of speculation. Prosecutors debated charges. Analysts speculated about Goldman's liability. Credit flow stock hovered low but alive. Nothing was resolved, but everything had changed. One night, sitting on the balcony with Chris, the city humming beneath us, I let out a breath I had been holding for months. The fight was far from over, but something inside me had shifted. The story was no longer only about Victoria and Alex. It was about me, about what I chose to carry forward and what I finally set down. And yet, beneath the fragile calm, I knew the next chapter was waiting. The law moves slowly, but when it moves, it does not stop. The reckoning was not finished. It was only circling closer. Walking into the SEC office that morning, I felt the weight of years pressing down on my shoulders. The glass walls and gray carpets were sterile, almost clinical, yet I could hear my own heartbeat louder than the hum of fluorescent lights. They called me a protected whistleblower, but that word didn't capture the nausea of sitting across from federal investigators, while knowing my parents still thought of me as the traitor who broke our family. When I finished giving my statement, I stepped outside into the sharp wind and checked my phone. There were 3 missed calls from my mother, 1 from my father, all unanswered. Their voicemails carried the same refrain: keep this quiet, do not drag our name further through the mud. Not once did they ask if I was holding up, if I was afraid, if I needed them. Later that evening, Chris came by with takeout and a quiet smile. He didn't press me for details, just let me sit on the couch while the food grew cold between us. For the first time all day, I felt seen not as a witness or a daughter, but simply as myself. Meanwhile, the family fractures deepened. Emma and Patricia spoke out in my defense at a tense Sunday gathering, their voices sharp against the silence of others who refused to look me in the eye. Some cousins whispered that I had destroyed harmony, as if harmony had ever existed under Victoria's rule of image and fear. I realized then that truth never repairs everything. Sometimes it only exposes the cracks that were already there, leaving each person to decide which side of the fault line they belong on. 18 months later, I stood at the window of my office on Park Avenue, looking down at the restless city that had once felt like a battlefield and now felt almost like an ally. The skyline glittered with steel and glass, and somewhere among those towers was the Manhattan multifamily complex. No longer just a set of documents in a thick envelope, but a living, breathing success story. 15 buildings, fully leased, 2,000 apartments with waiting lists, and a reputation in the real estate world that surpassed every forecast. The foundation's $20 million investment had already doubled, and the returns had allowed us to expand grants to more than 500 women entrepreneurs. Some ran bakeries, some tech startups, some nonprofit ventures, but all of them carried the same light I once fought to keep alive in myself. The SEC investigation still dragged on. Alex had been hit with a $25 million fine, a number so large it made headlines yet so small compared to the arrogance that had created it. Criminal charges were pending, the legal process grinding forward with the patience of stone. His marriage with Victoria was a skeleton of what it had been. They showed up to hearings together, but the distance between them was visible even to photographers waiting on courthouse steps. She had been forced into a lower-level position at Goldman, working under constant supervision, stripped of the glamour she once wielded like a weapon. My parents had changed in ways I never thought possible. It was not a sudden transformation, not an apology wrapped in tears, but a slow, halting attempt to rebuild trust. My mother began calling with questions about the foundation's projects instead of demanding silence. My father showed up at one of our events and stood in the back, listening as young founders shared how a grant had changed their lives. They did not ask for forgiveness outright, but in their tentative gestures, I saw the outline of something that might one day resemble reconciliation. Chris and I had built a life together that felt steady in a way I had never known. We got engaged on a quiet night at home, no audience, no spectacle, just a ring slipped onto my finger while I was still in sweatpants. We planned a small wedding for the following spring, something intimate, without hashtags or live streams, just love as it was meant to be. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a family of my own, not defined by old wounds but by new choices. One afternoon, a letter arrived in thick cream-colored stationery. I recognized Victoria's handwriting immediately. She wrote that she finally understood the damage she had done, that the consequences had been hers to bear, and that she was trying to rebuild from a smaller foundation brick by brick. She did not beg for reconciliation or offer excuses. She simply acknowledged what was broken. I did not respond, but I placed the letter in a drawer where I keep reminders of my own growth. Not as an invitation to reopen old scars, but as proof that even the most stubborn hearts can learn. The night of the Foundation's second annual gala, I walked into the ballroom and stopped for a moment at the entrance. The room shimmered with women who had turned their dreams into realities, women who had been dismissed or overlooked, women who were now CEOs, designers, innovators. They crowded around tables, laughing, networking, raising glasses to futures they had been told were impossible, when Dr. Maria Santos stepped onto the stage to announce that the Foundation's portfolio had surpassed 100 thriving businesses. The applause was thunderous. I felt tears burn behind my eyes. That was the $2 billion lesson. Not the paper value of projects or the net worths listed in glossy magazines. It was the realization that money could be lost and earned again, but respect, trust, and integrity once destroyed could not be bought back at any price. Victoria had lost more than investments. She had lost the relationships that could have held her when her empire cracked. I had spent years believing I was the weaker sister, the one who never measured up. But standing in that ballroom, surrounded by proof of what I had built, I understood that real success multiplies when it is shared, not hoarded. If you have ever been underestimated by your own family, share your story in the comments. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is prove them wrong by succeeding on your own terms. Subscribe for more stories about turning family rejection into personal triumph, and remember, your worth is not determined by who believes in you, but by who you choose to become despite their doubts. Later that night, after the gala ended and the last of the guests drifted into the New York night, I stayed behind in the quiet ballroom. The tables were bare now, just a few half-empty glasses and napkins left behind like echoes of the celebration. I walked up to the stage where the microphone still stood and ran my fingers along the polished wood of the podium. Hours earlier, I had stood here, introducing entrepreneurs whose lives had changed because someone finally believed in them. The applause was still ringing in my ears, louder in memory than it had been in the moment. Chris found me there, his tie loosened, his jacket slung over one shoulder. He asked if I was ready to leave, but I shook my head. I wanted to stand in the stillness for a little longer. I told him that for so long I had measured myself against a yardstick built by my family, and every inch I fell short had cut me deeper than I admitted. Tonight, that yardstick felt irrelevant. I no longer needed their approval to feel whole. Chris took my hand and said that the world had finally caught up to what he had always seen in me. On the car ride home, I thought about the arc of it all, how humiliation at a wedding check-in desk had been the spark for everything that followed. I thought about Victoria's face when she realized the opportunity she had dismissed had grown into something beyond her reach. I thought about Alex, once so smug at family dinners, now tethered to lawyers and fines that could not wash away the stain of his choices. And I thought about myself not in comparison to them, but as someone who had survived being underestimated and had learned to stop underestimating herself. Back at our apartment, I opened the drawer where I kept Victoria's letter. I reread it slowly, tracing each word, then set it back down without adding a reply. Some chapters did not need a continuation, they just needed to be closed. I slipped off my shoes, leaned into Chris's shoulder, and for the first time in years felt the kind of peace that was not fragile or fleeting. It was steady, earned, and mine. The camera would fade in on Manhattan's skyline at dusk, the lights of the city flickering like constellations against the glass towers. Inside a penthouse ballroom, women in bright dresses and sharp suits laughed, clinked glasses, and swapped stories of victories once thought impossible. At the center of it all, I stood near the balcony, looking out over the city that had once made me feel so small. Behind me, the foundation's banner caught the glow of chandeliers, empowering women, building futures. The numbers were staggering now: 500 entrepreneurs funded, thousands of jobs created, ripples spreading far beyond anything I could have imagined that night in Greenwich when humiliation became fuel. The camera would cut briefly, Alex exiting a courthouse, his face hidden beneath a storm of reporters' microphones. Victoria at a modest office desk, typing quietly under a supervisor's watchful eye. My parents at home setting aside their pride long enough to pick up the phone, hesitating before dialing my number. Then back to me, stepping forward as the crowd erupted into applause for the women whose lives had changed. My smile wasn't just for them. It was for the girl I used to be, the one who thought she would never measure up. The final shot would linger on my hand resting in Chris's, the ring catching the light before the screen cut to black. The lesson was never about $2 billion. It was about reclaiming your worth and proving that true success is never solitary.